Good evening. I'm Brent Reedy, the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Research Libraries, and it is such an honor to have you here tonight at the New York Public Library. Thank you for being here. Gary Marcus is here tonight. He is, for those who do not know, a leading voice in the future of artificial intelligence, and he's here to talk about that scary future in his new book, Taming Silicon Valley. Gary is a scientist, a best-selling author, a serial entrepreneur, I guess social as well. He's well known for his research in human language development and cognitive neuroscience, as well as his challenges to contemporary AI. He has anticipated many of the limitations that we face, and he anticipated them decades ago. And if any of you follow his Substack, you'll know that many still fail to recognize the things that he anticipated decades ago. In fact, we at the library called on Gary for advice this summer. We had a canary in the coal mine moment. A patron came into the Rosemain Reading Room and went up to a librarian and requested an article. Simple enough. The article didn't exist. The patron was real. The request was serious. We realized that the source they were asking for was hallucinated by a large language model. And the patron, a graduate student in a PhD program, I believe, did not know that was possible. Which is to say, we are also eager to understand how AI can work for us and not against us. So we've been looking forward to this program. The book sounds the alarm over big tech's role in the future of AI. It's a warning that current AI is both morally and technically inadequate, and that big tech has effectively captured policymakers who might set us on a more virtuous path. But the book is not without hope. Gary envisions a number of possible futures in the book, including one where AI is leveraged to revolutionize science and medicine and technology and deliver a world of abundance and better health. He also envisions futures where it contributes to the downfall of democracy or extinction, but I'll let Gary tell us more about that in just a moment. Gary will be joined in conversation this evening with award-winning investigative journalist Julia Engwin. She's the co-founder of Markup, a not-for-profit newsroom that investigates the impact of technology on society. So safe to say, I think they will have a lot to talk about. At the end of their discussion, there will be time for a few questions from the audience. You should have gotten little note cards on the way in. Go ahead and write your question down during the talk. One of my colleagues will circulate close to the end of our time together to gather those questions. If you are watching there out online, you can go ahead and just drop the question in the chat at any point. Live from New York Public Library is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Ispahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and, of course, all of your support. Thank you for being here, and please welcome Julia and Gary.
Hello. Thank you all for coming out. It's hard to think about AI sometimes this week, so I appreciate.
Or maybe you should think about it even more.
Or maybe you should think about it more. So here we are to discuss Gary's book. When I read it, I felt this great sense of relief because I basically felt like, I can just give this book to people in my life who keep asking me all these questions about AI, and it is like a perfect encapsulation kind of my views. I felt like I was in violent agreement with you, which actually is very rare for me.
Very rare for me, too.
Exactly. So I wanted to start with just a little bit about your background. You are, I grew up in Silicon Valley. I kind of came of age in that world, and then I became a reporter who writes about the industry. And you also grew up as a techie and actually built some AI products, sold them to Uber, And so, how did you go from being inside and loving it to writing a book about how we should tame Silicon Valley?
Well, I think it's a tale of disgust and disappointment. I loved AI since I was a little kid. My godmother is in the room, and she knows when I first started playing with computers and actually played a small role in that. Even before that, I had played with a paper computer when I was 8 years old. And as soon as I learned what it was to code things, I was off to the races thinking about how you could make machines do smart things. I tried to, I did write a Latin translator into English that I used to go to high school early, to go from high school to college early. I was always interested in AI, and I always thought that AI would be good for society. And I think most of the reason that people went into it for a long time was they were just interested in an intellectual question, which is, how do you make a machine smart? Which I think is still a legitimately interesting question. I would say it's an unsolved question despite all of the hype, and maybe we'll get into that. But things changed, especially when ChatGPT came out. So before ChatGPT came out, there was an interesting landmark when something called Tay was released, which I'm sure you remember. Not everybody in the audience will, but it was a chatbot, a little bit like ChatGPT. And within 12 hours, it started spouting Nazi slogans and things like that. And so Microsoft, who had released it, took it off the market. They said, okay, it's not responsible to do this. And in fact, the president of Microsoft, and I'm sure you know this, wrote a book about responsible AI. And that was, I think, the mood in the Valley. It was like, yeah, AI could really help us, but there are risks here, and we need to take it slow. And everything changed in November of 2022. So the technology that OpenAI was using wasn't really new. In fact, it had been invented in Google a few years before, but Google hadn't released it. Google thought, there's still a lot of bugs in this system. It's not ready for prime time. But ChatGPT was a little scrappy startup at the time, and they're like, we can take the risk. We're going to put it out. We'll see what happens. And even they were surprised. They didn't expect that 100 million people were going to start using it. So they put it out, and suddenly, like, dollar signs flashed in everybody's heads, including Microsoft. So Microsoft had been big on responsible AI, but there was almost a repeat of Tay, which was a New York Times reporter did an interview, Kevin Roose, with with Bing, or Sydney, I guess was called at the time, and it told him to divorce his wife, and said it was in love with him, all this kind of crazy stuff. And when that happened, I wasn't surprised. I knew how dumb the underlying technology was. I've been trying to tell people that for a while. I wasn't surprised that it could go off the rails, but it became public how far it could go off the rails, and I expected Microsoft would take it off the market, and they didn't. So they had a stake, I should have said this, in OpenAI. And they suddenly thought, wow, we can get really rich off of this. And so they abandoned their investment, I think, in responsible AI. They actually fired some people working on responsible AI. And the CEO, Satya Nadella, said he wanted to make Google dance. And he kind of did. So up until that point, Google wasn't releasing these products. They were still testing them internally, trying to put guardrails, as we would call them guardrails around it, as we would call them now. Not particularly successfully, and so Google wasn't releasing these things, and then suddenly they had to in order to keep up with Microsoft. Everyone was worried that ChatGPT was going to steal Google's search market, which I said isn't actually going to happen and has not actually happened, but people were worried about that, and there was a lot of rushing forward. And so the climate changed, and it changed also culturally, from a bunch of AI researchers trying to figure out how to make smarter stuff to a bunch of people trying to figure out how do we make money off of these large language models, which we'll probably get into. This has not actually been as easy as people thought. But the whole culture changed. And I kind of went from loving the field to really, really being revolted by it. And then on the technical side, I could see the problems with it, why it wasn't going to be reliable, and why I think I said to the New York Times, I said something like, it's a perfect storm of corporate irresponsibility, unreliable technology, and people trying to put this in every place. And that's just not a good idea.
Yeah. It's funny because about a year ago, maybe it was a year and a half ago, you were one of the people who signed the letter asking for a 6-month moratorium on AI, right? There was this feeling right after ChatGPT came out.
I do need to interject.
Oh, yeah.
I'll let you finish the question,
Yeah.
but maybe if I can interject. A lot of people misunderstood that letter.
Okay.
I even was, when I spoke at the U.S. Senate, I was asked about it by one of the senators, I forget who. Why did you sign that pause letter? So I just want to clarify. I did sign the pause letter. I didn't write it. It got a lot of attention. My most famous tweet back when I was not revolted by the site the way that I am now was actually about the pause letter. What the pause letter actually called for was not to pause all of AI. It was to pause one particular research project, which was GPT-5, which ironically nobody's actually been able to build, but we didn't know that then. And we can get into that as well. But so it was like, hey, we already know GPT-4, this very popular thing, is very unreliable. It may be harmful. We don't really understand it. Let's take 6 months and just figure out where we are before we, try to build a bigger, maybe better, but maybe more dangerous version of it. We didn't call for the banning of other research. It was really this one thing, and we said we should spend more time investigating safety. How do you make these things safe and secure? And we can talk about some of the limits. And so we said, let's just hold off on this one project that we really don't understand. The truth is we still don't. So that was, I'm trying to think, that was March or April of 2023. So a lot has happened and a lot hasn't happened, I guess, in the subsequent 18 months. But when we signed that, right, so GPT-5 hasn't actually come out.
But it's just around the corner, they keep saying.
Yeah, there's a old computer journalist I used to read, Jerry Pournelle, back when I was like a teenager, and he wrote for Byte magazine, and he had this phrase called "real soon now" with all capital letters. Real soon now meant we have no idea, but we want to tell you about it, and we're all excited. And that's what GPT-5 has been about. I wrote a whole column in my Substack about all of the predictions people made. They're always so excited. They're like, GPT-5 is going to drop right after the Super Bowl. It's going to be amazing. That was last year's Super Bowl. And these things just keep going. People are like dreaming of it. Maybe, well, I'll just...
Well, I was going to use it as a jumping off point to discuss that it was interpreted as, risk about, what people call existential risk about AI, which is like, okay, if you all remember when these first came out, right, there were people who quit their jobs saying like the AI is too powerful, it's too dangerous, we have to be worried. And so there was this whole movement that I think is called existential risk, or, they call themselves X-riskers, but that worries about AI being so powerful that it'll like destroy humanity. And in your book, you talk about how you think that's an overblown concern. And so I wanted to understand more about that.
Yeah, so I don't say that it's absolutely impossible, but it shouldn't be high on your list of risks. So I think there are much more tangible risks about AI that are here right now. Like, we know that these systems are covertly racist and they're being used to make employment decisions. Like, that's here and now. We know they're being used for misinformation. That's here and now. This notion of existential risk is more speculative. I think it's unlikely if you take it literally. So if you take it literally, it's about the existence of the human species. And it's really hard to wipe us out. I mean, think about COVID. COVID-19 was...
It tried.
It tried, but, we're resourceful, we're geographically diverse, we're genetically diverse. Some people weren't affected by it, some people were hit hard. In the end, it killed, I think, 1% of the population, which is awful and terrible, but is a long way from killing 1% of the population to killing 100%. So the people who take this literally existential risk, and there are a lot of people who do it, are concerned that somehow, they're always very vague at the somehow. It's like the old Einstein or whatever, is it Sidney Harris cartoon where there's a bunch of equations and in the middle it says, and then a miracle happens here? I guess it would be like the opposite of that cartoon. And then a disaster happens here. And they're always very vague about the disaster. But the idea is, and then this disaster happens, and then we all die. It's like somehow like the robots kill us all. Like, really, they're going to hunt us all down? We're not going to have any reply? Like, there are milder versions of this, I think, probably are more plausible. The thing that I'm actually most worried about is misinformation. And misinformation could have really serious consequences. It could lead, for example, to a nuclear war. So I could paint some scenarios of that, like, we blame the Russians for doing a bunch of bad stuff that's actually someone using generative AI to disrupt society, and then we go after the Russians, and there's acceleration and stuff. So like the risk of accelerating conflict with these tools is pretty high. But nuclear war isn't literally existential. It's really, really bad, but it's not actually going to annihilate the species. And at least right now, I'm not that worried about robots. I'm worried about drones. They're probably the biggest danger. The idea that like robots are going to come to your house and stuff like that, I wrote about 5 years ago in my last book, Rebooting AI, and I gave some advice, and I think it's still pretty good advice. If the robots come from you, number one, lock the door. Like, ain't no robot going to get through a locked door. I mean, eventually maybe, but not right now. So, they're a long way from that level. Robots are still clumsy. If you saw Elon Musk's demonstration at his recent Tesla, whatever the day where he also had those robots were all teleoperated with people with joysticks. Like, as long as they're teleoperated with people with joysticks, they're not that much of a threat.
My favorite videos are the ones from Boston Dynamics, which I don't know if people have seen, with the robots running around doing sort of exercises, but then...
And dancing.
If they put a banana peel, then the robot slips and it's all
I
over.
think that was actually in my list, was banana peels. Another one, just in case you need this advice ever, is climb a tree. Like, robots can't climb trees. So, like, I'm not that worried about that particular risk.
But since you brought up
For now.
misinformation, I think we should talk about the election. There's a lot of reports coming out that this might have been the most misinformed electorate. We don't know yet, really. I will say that I personally have been testing AI all year to see how the leading models respond to questions about the election and voting at my nonprofit newsroom called Proof News, and we have consistently found that they provided misinformation about voting access, about candidates, about policy issues, about pretty much everything we've tested. And so...
And by the way, that's fantastic work. And you may not know this, but part of the reason I invited you to interview me, or nominated you, I guess I didn't make the invitation, but I nominated you was because I really liked that work and thought it was so
Thank you.
important.
Yeah, it's been really dispiriting because we started doing this testing in January, and I actually thought that by testing over and over repeatedly throughout the year, the models would improve, right? Especially since they know we're doing it and we keep publishing the stories, and strangely they didn't, which is very upsetting. And so I guess I'm wondering, it's really hard to know, right? Everyone was panicked about how much AI would impact the election, and we're a week out. But what is your assessment of is there anything we can say about what may have played out with AI in the election?
I'm going to rewind just for a second, and then I'll come to that. So you expressed surprise that they didn't get any better despite having a lot of data. And I'm not actually that surprised. So hallucinations, as we call these things now, I may have had a hand in popularizing that term. It's not perfect, but that's what we call them now. These errors that these large language models create are inherent to how they work. So we project onto them a lot of intelligence. Because they say things that sound like humans, we sort of imagine them to be humans, but they're not like humans at all. So they can't, for example, sanity check their own work. They can't fact check their own work. They just learn statistics about how different words are used in different contexts. And that's very superficial. And so they're constantly making these mistakes. And I'll give you an example of them actually getting worse. In the book, I have an example where somebody asked one of these systems to make a biography of me. And it did, and it said that I owned a pet chicken named Henrietta.
Amazing.
Which, as it turns out, I do not. I don't have a pet chicken. I wouldn't name it Henrietta. And somebody a week ago used another one, maybe it was ChatGPT, and it had even more detail about my relationship with the pet chicken Henrietta, even though this is by now a published example. I've written about it 5 times and so forth. These systems are very unwieldy, and people do put Band-Aids on them, and so they probably did put some Band-Aids around your election information, where the polls and stuff like that, but the Band-Aids just don't work that well because they don't match. They're almost like oil and water. They don't fit with the underlying mechanism how these things actually work. Now, how much damage did the elections do, I think is going to be very hard to establish with certainty. It's one of these questions about causal relationships are hard to figure out, and there are multiple variables and so forth. But I have also seen, some suggestion that this was among the most misinformed electorate. You can easily see it in things like, well, first of all the Google searches on tariffs, like the day after the election, people should have figured out what a tariff was before they cast their votes, and they didn't. And you have lots of people who thought the economy is in terrible shape, and most indicators are actually that the economy was great. So I would say there was certainly a lot of misinformation floating around. Establishing causality is hard, and establishing, how much of that was generated by AI. Social media was clearly partly responsible. Cable TV has been responsible for misinformation for a long time. And so it's hard to know exactly which of these factors, but there's no question that there was a huge amount of misinformation. There's no question that people were in fact using bot farms powered by AI to create some of that misinformation. I think the government reported on that a couple of times, and I'm sure some of that will come out over time, or maybe it won't given the new administration, but it would have come out in a different administration that would have had more interest in exploring these issues.
Yeah. You have this line in your book, which I really like, where you say that generative AI is the machine gun of disinformation, which is it takes something that you used to have to do manually.
That's right. And I would go around and tell people you should be worried about misinformation. They'd be like, well, we already had some. I'd be like, but it's the difference between a knife and a machine gun. If you scale things up, you make them cheaper to use, and that's what happened, then more people are going to use them. So in the 2016 election, Russia was spending $1 million a month on one bot farm that was in the Mueller report. There are probably others. And what they did for $1 million a month could be done a whole lot cheaper, maybe for hundreds of dollars a month right now. And so anybody basically can spin up a misinformation farm now. And it's worth remembering the so-called Russian fire hose of propaganda model, which I'm sure you know very well. The point is not to sell one particular lie. The point is to have so much misinformation. Can I say the Bannon line here? Or is to flood the zone with shit. And you get to this point where people don't trust anything. And that's very effective. And that's kind of what we saw, is people just decide, I'm going to believe the people that agree with me. And so the democracy can't really function. Democracy can't function if it's like destroying the raw materials of democracy. The raw material of democracy is information, people making decisions based on information about what they think is appropriate for the world. But if they don't have that information, then they can't really make rational decisions, and then democracy doesn't really work. And I would say, regardless of how much AI contributed to that, and I assume it's some but hard to measure, that is kind of the story we just saw.
Yeah, and it's also massively affecting my profession, journalism, because it gives people another reason to think, oh, this is probably just like all the other information I'm seeing out there that's not trustworthy. But let's talk one more thing about the election, which is it's a major political realignment, right? So we have Republican control of all branches of government. And
is the House fully decided?
Yes, apparently, as of today.
As if we didn't have enough bad news. Anyway, some people might think that.
And so, when you wrote this, I think there was some hope. Maybe there were going to be AI regulations, and you proposed a few options of things we might want to do. This is a pretty deregulatory crowd. So I'm curious, how are we going to tame Silicon Valley without government?
So I'll take that in two parts. First, I'll put a footnote. The wild card in this is Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Elon Musk is genuinely concerned about AI risk. He has many other concerns and financial pursuits and so forth. The only thing that I can see that's happy about this situation is there is a piece of him that really cares. We'll see whether he does anything around that. He also owns an AI company that's, I think, about to be valued at $40 billion. So he has strong economic incentive conflicting with his concern about this. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where this is going to land. He actually supported, and this shows that I think there's some genuineness to him on some issues. He supported the California SB 1047, which was a bill that would have given companies some liability for things that caused catastrophic harm, which was measured as something that cost $500 million to repair or a certain number of lives. And so he actually supported that. So there's a small thread What he would actually support, I don't know. Clearly, he's the strongest voice on technology of the people that Trump has thus far assembled. Maybe some of the things that I put in there might get through, but the thesis of the book was that AI is going to be like social media, but worse. That social media has really harmed society. It's really harmed teenage girls. It's led to more and more polarization, which we saw in the election, and that for a bunch of reasons, AI is going to make that worse. One thing that I undersold, I think, in the book was surveillance, and maybe we can talk about that in a minute, and why I think OpenAI is going to be pushed towards surveillance. And maybe several of these companies are. But so the first thesis of the book is that social media was bad, AI is going to be worse. And we can't expect the companies to self-regulate. That didn't work with social media. It's not going to work with AI. The second thesis of the book was government's probably not going to take care of this. My hope in writing the book was we would have a democratic administration, frankly, that would be more sympathetic towards regulation. And partly the book was, a guide to what I thought would be effective. But even when I wrote it, I wasn't all that confident even that a Democratic Congress was going to get through what we wanted. In fact, part of why I wrote the book was I didn't think that Chuck Schumer was going to push the regulations that I thought we should. And in fact, he didn't. He kind of ran out the clock and didn't get anything done before the change in regime. So, the second thesis of the book was certainly correct, which is that government's probably not going to, in the U.S., going to do what we need. Europe's a different situation. They actually have some regulation around AI. And the third thesis of the book is that we, the public, need to get loud and demand the protections that we need. And I still think that that's the only path open to us. I will give you an argument, which probably not get the traction that it deserves, but I'll give you an argument here, which is that we should boycott generative AI. So there's some AI, I should have clarified this before, that's perfectly fine, like GPS navigation systems. I have no issue with that kind of AI. That helps a lot of people a lot of the time. It only very rarely leads to any kind of problem. It doesn't hallucinate. That's great AI. AI for Google search is pretty good. It tells you the source. You can go look at the source yourself. So there's lots of AI I like. I'm mostly talking about these chatbots and generative AI. Those are the ones that concern me. So here's my argument. Generative AI has more harms maybe than good, or at least it's like, to me, it's not a clear win. What do you actually use generative AI for? Well, it was super fun when it came out. Everybody wrote poetry and song lyrics, and but the poetry wasn't really that good. Nobody remembers a poem. That
It's just good at rhyming.
It's just good at rhyming. My colleague Ernie Davis at NYU, who I've written a lot with, actually did a study of the poetry, and the only thing it can do is rhyming couplets. You try to get something, blank verse, and it's like completely lost. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't really that good a poet. Some people use it for brainstorming, or if they have to write exercises for their grade school classes. There's some value. Computer programmers use it. That's still actually mixed. They love it, but some of the data suggests that it's introducing more bugs that are harder to fix and so forth. So we're going to need long-term studies to know how much benefit there is. But there's some very clear costs. So some of them I already talked about. So there, misinformation risks, the racism, and so forth. There are other kinds of risks and costs too. These things are incredibly environmentally expensive. And the only theory that people have about how to make them better, because everybody sees that they have problems, is to make them bigger, put in more data, use more energy, cause more emissions in the environment, waste more water. So that's not good for any of us. And then there's another thing, which is they steal. The companies that are training these things are stealing from artists, from writers, and so forth, massively. I think Justine Bateman, the actress, said it was the biggest theft in U.S. history. And so far they've gotten away with it. That's still an unfolding thing. But so there are all of these, what economists would call negative externalities of generative AI. And the classic model of that is some factory just dumps chemicals into the water, and then we deal with, as a society, deal with the birth defects and the cleanup and so forth. And we could say, no, we've seen that movie. Why should you do, there's this phrase I love, why should we privatize the gains and socialize the cost? Why should we as a society have to pay all these costs? So we could say, look, we would love it if you could come up with AI that's as good as the kinds of stuff you've promised, that's going to solve physics, as Sam Altman once said, which I don't even think it makes sense. But, if you can come up with AI that solves physics, then great. But if you have AI that writes, mediocre poetry and you're dumping emissions into the environment and stealing from artists, and you're going to steal from everybody else, that's the game plan here, we'll just say no. And so we could have a boycott and say, get your house in order. Make a generative AI or some other kind of AI that does the things that you promises, that doesn't hallucinate, that doesn't get abused so much, that doesn't destroy the environment, and we'll come back to you. In the meantime, and that licenses all the stuff, that one's easily solved. Just pay the artists that you're ripping off. You fix all that, and we'll be happy to use your product. And until then, we're just going to sit it out. We don't really need this stuff.
You have a good line in your book. You say that you want AI that focuses on reasoning and factuality rather than mimicry, which I think is such a perfect encapsulation of what these things are trying to do is just mimic sounding smart. It's like a dumb person trying to sound smart.
It is. It is very much like a dumb person trying to sound smart. And a lot of dumb people bought the act for a little while. I think people have caught on. Every CEO on the planet last year was like, Jones, get in here. How do we use the large language model in our product? And now, you go to meetings of CIOs, as I sometimes do, and they're all like, yeah, we've done some pilots. It's, we hope it'll get better. So let's talk about the we hope it will get better part. What I was saying in the quote is they're not going to get better. That they're not based in facts. They're based in statistics. They won't get better. And I became public enemy number one. Seriously, in the machine learning field, I got attacked literally every day on Twitter. But I said that we're going to see a phase of diminishing returns. That yes, making these things bigger has made them better for a while, but this won't continue indefinitely. It's not going to solve the hallucination problem. And people scoffed, and even Reid Hoffman said that we're going to solve this was last year. We're going to solve it all in a few months. People just basically dismissed what I was saying. And remarkably, in the last 3 weeks, everybody has come around. None of them, of course, giving me any credit whatsoever. But that's
we'll give you the credit here.
But that's a separate issue. But it appears that OpenAI, in fact, is struggling to make GPT-5, as I anticipated. It appears that Google is having trouble making their next model. It appears that Anthropic is having trouble. That they had these, what they called scaling laws, and I kept warning, they're not actually laws of the universe. They're just generalizations you've seen for a while. And the generalization seems to have run out. So they all underwhelmed by their most recent systems. And OpenAI, if you follow them closely, has been introducing new models. And instead of calling one of them GPT-5, they're like, it's GPT-01 or 4.x or 4 turbo and all this stuff. And if you ask yourself, why are they doing that? It's because they know it's not good enough to be GPT-5. People's fantasy is that GPT-5 is going to be, human level intelligence, that you can trust it, whatever. And the products they've actually been able to make are not that, because there's been diminishing returns. That's partly because there's not enough fresh data. They kind of used everything. It's partly because they don't represent facts. They don't actually reason over facts. And so all of these companies, these are all leaks, but basically there have been leaks from 3 of the biggest companies in the last 7 days. And then Ilya Sutskever, who is one of the founders of OpenAI, also said the same thing. And so now all of a sudden, Reuters ran a piece yesterday about the generative AI plateau, and Business Insider had an article. And so everybody's finally waking up. I've been arguing for a while, and I think we were going to talk about this, whether the whole thing might collapse in some sense. And I keep having this image, and I've written about it, of Wile E. Coyote at the end of a cliff, right? Wile E. Coyote, or off the end of the cliff, doesn't fall until he looks down, right? And I've been thinking about, is there going to be a crash? So it's not that large language models will disappear. The technology exists. People will find some use for it. They're getting very cheap because there's so much competition. But the valuations of these companies are astronomical. So you start with OpenAI. It's valued at $150 billion. You know how much profit they've ever made? 0, right? They're losing money left and right. They've lost a lot of staff. Other people have caught up with them. The valuation makes no sense. And so I've been calling them, or saying that it's likely that they would become the WeWork work of AI. And and also now their marriage is on the rocks. So they were married to Microsoft, and now Microsoft is distancing themselves and so forth. And so we could have this collapse. Like they're the poster child, right? And so if suddenly people are like, we're not going to give them another round of funding, then the way their deal is structured, they're going to be in deep trouble if they can't raise the next round of funding. And they're spending money. My mom likes to say like water, but it's much faster than that. I mean, they're spending, $10 billion a year or something like that. And so they just raised $6.5 billion, and that sounds like a lot, but it only actually carries them, 6 months. And so I think that a lot of the enthusiasm comes because people think they're going to get rich. And we saw this with like Web3 and crypto and whatever. Yep. And people start running for the hills. I saw on one of the social media sites today a picture of a bunch of people like climbing on trains. And the caption was, it was real footage, but they had a joking caption. It was something like, people leaving AI to go back to crypto.
Well, it is funny because I had in my notes, we were supposed to have this conversation a month ago, and we had to postpone. And in my questions here, I had a thing that said, are we going to see a crash like crypto? But the funny thing is crypto's had this incredible rebound because of, the
politics,
the new incoming administration's embrace of crypto. And so suddenly I felt like that question is not as relevant as it was. But I do think it's a really important point about the fact that, one of the ways this technology might be, quote, tamed is actually by the market, right? That nobody wants to buy it. And that, I think, raises the question that I do really want to talk about, which is surveillance, because that is what they're going to sell it for. And that is what AI is really good at, is surveillance, because it's really one of the things. I wrote a book about privacy in 2014, Dragnet Nation, and I'm been a privacy reporter and a paranoid privacy person for a long time. And the thing that always made me feel better about privacy was like, oh, well, they still have to get someone to watch all of those videos, and so at least they won't really go through them all. But now AI can do all those things, and it's a very scary thing because that's probably the likely business model, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I've been warning about this for a little while. The OpenAI sort of already gave you the first part of the argument, right? They're losing a lot of money. And the second part of the argument is part of why they're losing money is because customers don't actually know what to do with the technology, right? Because it hallucinates, because it makes errors. And so where do they go? Well, big government contracts. And they won't just be in the US, right? They just took a lot of funding from Saudi Arabia. They're going to, sell to a lot of people. And so they don't really have another adequate way of making money. The technology doesn't have to work that well to be a surveillance technology. If you want to use it to make your quarterly projections, it has to actually be smart. But if you just want to collect what are all the things that people typed into ChatGPT, well, that's a lot of information. It doesn't matter if the system doesn't understand it. They have that. And some people treat it as a therapist or girlfriend or whatever. So people are spilling their most intimate secrets. Some people are. Companies are putting in private data in these pilots and stuff like that. So there's incredible amount of data. And then as I mentioned in the book, and then there's something that came out after I finished the book. As I mentioned in the book, Sam Altman has said he wants people's emails, he wants their calendars, he wants their documents. And at least when the marriage with Microsoft was stronger, it looked like they were about to get it. Now it's a little bit more complicated. So there's all that. And then they just bought a share in a webcam company, and that gave me chills. And they put Paul Nakasone, who used to be on the NSA, on their board. And that's got to be, to try to make those contracts. And so I think every sign points to that. And then the other thing that maybe points to that is 25 of their AI safety and other people left the company, major people left the company. I think you could read that. I don't know for sure, but as people being unhappy with the direction, and that might be part of the direction. That's just speculation in the last part, but to me, it kind of all fits together. And even if you drop that speculation, it still seems pretty clear.
Yeah. I mean, one of the stats that I think is so amazing is about the increase in accuracy of facial recognition. So about 10 years ago, the error rate for facial recognition systems was 30%. It's gone down to 0.3%. And that's because of AI. And so we're really, we've already seen in facial recognition the incredible amount of accuracy difference. And the idea of that kind of technology being everywhere is one that is really terrifying.
I think it's imminent and not much is going to stop it.
Yeah, and I think that's one reason I want to like ask you again about the boycott idea, because I'm not sure we're going to be able to boycott this technology. Like, I mean, sure, you could not use ChatGPT, but it's embedded. I can't write a document. Google keeps bugging me while I'm writing Google Docs, like use Gemini, and like it's starting to be embedded in everything. And so I'm just wondering what other kind of
I think it would take a
resistance-
social movement, which there are little pieces, there are little threads there. So, like, there are people now saying, like, this product created without generative AI and stuff like that. So, like, there's already a little bit of resistance. It's not nearly enough. You could, if enough people boycotted, get companies to say, all right, fine, I won't train on stuff that I don't have copyright to. Or don't have license to. If you could get like one player to move forward, I mean, we've seen things like fair trade coffee and stuff like that. Once in a while, these things work. I mean, the odds are against us. Like, I don't think they're great. But
fair trade AI.
fair trade AI. There's actually
They'd have to pay all the artists that they stole.
there
right?
are actually some small movements to do that, but they're not at the scale. There's not enough people that care. Like, we would have to, as citizens, say, this is not acceptable to us. And I mean, more broadly, like, do we want to give all our power to tech oligarchs, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's really what the book is about. And now one of the tech oligarchs is basically like the vice president of the United States, effectively.
Yeah.
And like, we could say, we don't want to give them this much power. But we would have to take an active role in order to do that.
Okay, well, I hope that we'll get questions from the audience, because I want to hear from all of you. But while we're waiting for those to come here, I wanted to ask you about the counter argument that people make. So the argument I hear to the argument you're making is that, you know, it's sort of the guns don't kill people, people kill people argument. So there's this argument like, well, everything you're saying is just about how people use AI, and it's not about the AI itself. And so I just want to hear your response to that.
I mean, there's a little bit of truth to that. And I mean, technically speaking, you know, you have to have a person fire the gun, but like, you know, a gun is built to kill people and ought to have some regulation about when you kill people. And there ought to be some regulation around AI. So, you know, I mean, it's true. Like what I was talking about causality before. Things are multiply caused. You have gun manufacturers make the guns easier and cheaper and so forth, and that increases the chance they'll be used. And you have people who have bad intentions. It turns out that some technology lends itself to bad actions more than others, and I think generative AI particularly lends itself to bad actions. It's easy for bad actors, for example, to use them to create all kinds of spam and stuff like that. It's harder to use them for good actions. So, I mean, technologies actually differ in their ability to be abused, and
Right.
you know, the more that they can be abused, the more that we need some constraint around them. So we actually ought to have, you know, rules about registering guns, for example, and to some extent we do. Because that's how that technology gets used.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of amazing that they went to market with a product that they called intelligence, that they say very specifically is not factual or accurate, and is only designed to be plausible. And like that in itself is sort of just like,
yeah, the disclaimer is like, this is garbage, but people use it anyway because it's fun.
but
Can I
Yes.
drop in one other thing
Yeah.
while we're there? OpenAI's most recent model is called O1. And it's better in some ways, not in others. But the company themselves said that it might have an elevated risk of being used to devise bioweapons. That's a kind of serious thing. Now, my view is probably they're exaggerating that to sort of sound more important than they are. But it raises a kind of thought experiment. You know, maybe the next version really will, you know, maybe this one, you know, elevated a little bit, the next one will elevate bioweapons risk a lot more or whatever. So here's a thought experiment. Suppose that a company builds a technology that could cause some really pretty grievous harm. Not existential, not annihilating the species, but maybe killing off 1% of the population, let's say. So a company devises that. Who gets to decide whether they release it? Right? This is really the most important question in my mind. And there's two models here. One is some CEO who stands to make a lot of money makes that decision. That's the model we actually have right now. And the other would be more like the FDA, where there's some kind of panel of outside experts who evaluates the cost and the benefits and says, if the benefits exceed the cost, then we'll go ahead and ship it. And otherwise you have to go back to the drawing board or fix it. And maybe fixing it is just writing a disclaimer, and maybe that's not enough or whatever. So right now, Sam Altman made the decision to release O1. Pretty sure he made it essentially by himself. He's the CEO of OpenAI. A lot of the people in his company that might have disagreed have left. The board is basically rubber stamps, right? He got fired and rehired and basically built a board around himself. So there's nothing internal. And there's no government thing either. As much as I like the Biden executive order, which will probably be history at the beginning of or the end of January, it still had no teeth to actually prevent a company from releasing something, even if there are known enormous risks. We don't have any levers in the United States government to do that. There are some in Europe. In the United States, we really don't. There is some, you can do workarounds, like you can get the FTC, which is also probably going to be eviscerated to go after a company or something like that. But basically, we're sitting ducks. If somebody can build a technology that increases bioweapons risk or something like that, and someone like Sam Altman is like looking at the numbers and he's like, if we do this, then the company is going to survive, and if we don't, it's going to fail. They're going to do the risky thing, and there's nothing to stop them.
Well, we do have a bunch of people in here saying that this talk is too depressing. So there are some requests for a positive vision. So I'm wondering if you can give us something positive.
The positive vision is the same as it always was, which is that AI could really revolutionize medicine, could really revolutionize technology. The best example of this is something that Google DeepMind did called AlphaFold, which solves doesn't quite solve, but comes very close to solving a very important problem, which is if you have the string of letters in a strand of DNA, what protein does it create? And in particular, the three-dimensional geometry of that protein is incredibly important, because basically biology is a bunch of three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles. And so the more you can understand about what a protein is going to look like, the better you can try to create new drugs and so forth. So they have basically, and they just open source this today, so anybody can use it. They have created a technology which has some elements of generative AI and some elements of classical artificial intelligence kind of hybridized together. It's very focused on this one particular problem. It's not a general purpose chatbot or something like that. But this particular technology, for most purposes, solves that problem, or at least it gets it right a large fraction of the time. And so it's very useful. Biologists around the world use it all the time. That is an example of something that we could be doing that I think is great. It doesn't make Google a lot of money, and in fact, they open source the stuff. And so the market pressures are pushing people more towards chatbots, like how do we justify our $5 billion in NVIDIA chips that we're buying, and away from doing things like that. Google makes enough money selling ads that they decided to kind of float that project. We could, as a society, say, we want more of that. We're going to arrange our tax credits and so forth, so that if there's more of that science stuff that really contributes, not just like talk, we're going to use our chatbot for drug discovery, but like real technology that actually produces results, we could certainly give tax credits and things like that. So like, I don't think that positive vision is impossible, but I don't think we get it passively. And I mean, maybe the abstract way to put this whole book is that we can either be passive here and things are not going to turn out well, almost certainly, or we can be active. We can try to shape the kind of AI that we have. I think in Brent's introduction, he took a phrase from me, which is that the current AI is morally and technically inadequate. Well, that doesn't have to be. If we take an active role as a society and demand an AI that does go towards that positive vision and veers away from the negatives, then we could be sitting pretty. But we're not going to get it if we just sit around.
One of the things I've been joking about recently is that maybe the best thing AI has done for us is revitalize the nuclear power industry, because all three big tech companies have launched nuclear power initiatives in the past few weeks because they've maxed out all the other electricity in our country. I mean, it's not necessarily a good thing, but
they haven't quite maxed it out, but they're anticipating.
They're anticipating maxing it out. And so which is terrifying, right? Because we kind of need that for like other stuff. But if
Hospitals?
hospitals, food, agriculture, but bringing nuclear power back in a modern era is probably it's a good.
I think it's a good
A
thing.
green source of energy. Just trying to be positive here, guys. Okay, so question from someone who says, okay, if you could whisper one thing to Elon Musk, since you think he sort of might be receptive to AI regulation, what would you say?
I actually have an email in my head. I sometimes email with him once in a while. He writes
Okay.
back, which I haven't quite sent for various reasons. But it basically is, congratulations, don't forget AI risk.
Okay. A question on all the people whose work has been stolen for training AI. Do you have any ideas for them and like how to get compensation, how to get the consent and payment that you
Get everybody to join in making noise.
Yeah.
Say, we're going to stop making content if we don't get paid for it. And you're going to watch a bunch of boring gruel made by GPT-5 or whatever it is, and your lives are going to be poor. So stand with us, and also stand with us because you're going to be next. Like every business on the planet, I'm exaggerating a little bit, many, many businesses have keystroke loggers. And you know what they're thinking at these companies? We're going to figure out what people doing this or that job are doing, paralegals or whatever it is, and we're going to take that job too. And we're not going to compensate the people who've been doing the work there either, because if we can get away with it with artists and writers, nobody's going to care about the paralegals. Like,
Yeah. I mean, luckily, right, in Hollywood, they're unionized. They were able to strike and get some protections. But, one of the stories that my newsroom broke this year was about all the YouTubers whose data was stolen. We built a little search tool, actually, so that YouTubers could look up which of their videos were taken for training AI, and they're really mad, but they're not organized, right? They don't have, and that's true for a lot of industries.
I mean, without organization, we lose the whole ballgame.
Okay, so labor is solidarity is the answer.
We need some solidarity here, and I'm not optimistic about it. It's not like I'm blind and naive and think, I'm going to leave this room and you're all going to sign up to boycott. But I think that's the only move we've got left in the United States, given what just happened in the election.
Yeah. One questioner says they would like you to name some names about who you're most concerned about with regard to the moral descent of AI implementation. You mentioned Microsoft. I'm specifically interested in your thoughts on Apple, this person says.
On Apple? I mean, I'm less concerned about Apple. I'm most concerned about Sam Altman. He has been glorified. I think he's not actually that technically adept at AI. He sells hype constantly. I think he's a dishonest person. I wrote an article in The Guardian going into some details, including, I think, we swore to tell, I guess with the right hand, tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth when we spoke next to each other at the Senate. I don't think he did. I've documented some of the things that I think he omitted that were important and so forth. He started the company as a nonprofit, and now he's trying to turn it into a for-profit. He, next to me in the Senate, he told Senator Kennedy that he was doing it for health insurance and the love of it, and now he's trying to get $10 billion allegedly out of the formation of a for-profit. Like, he's just not, in my view, a straightforward person, shall we say. And he's quite powerful, at least at the moment. He has a board that will do what he wants. He's extremely well funded. Most of the people that might have been checks on him have left. And so he worries me the most. Apple, I'm not that worried. Apple has actually been relatively responsible about its rollout of AI. It's been very good about privacy relative to other companies. It's not perfect, but it's been quite good. They don't give me reason to be as worried. They're also, they still sell good products that actually work.
They do have a revenue stream. I mean, it's always
They have a revenue stream.
dangerous when companies don't have money. They act crazy.
Exactly. So OpenAI's revenue stream is hypothetical,
Yeah.
right? They have, they had their CFO make some reports about how they're going to make $100 billion in revenue 6 years from now, when so far they've made 5. And so, you have to kind of, have a lot of faith. And a lot of it is around the notion that like GPT-8 is going to be the greatest thing ever, and they can't even make GPT-5. So they're kind of in fantasy land, and fantasies have a way of running out and making people do desperate things. Apple is still selling iPhones every day. Google is still selling search ads every day. And so like those companies have less incentive to cut corners. And I mean, all of them knew how to make large language models and didn't. And so like, I wouldn't worry as much about Apple as I might some of the others.
Although I would say that our investigation found they were also using the stolen YouTube data. So
The-
no one is clean in this
Nobody's
industry.
completely clean. Nobody's completely clean. I mean, we're ranking here, right?
Yeah.
I guess I can say this in public. In the early draft of the book, which is sort of silly because there were only 2 drafts and I wrote it very quick, but in an early draft of the book, I had a section on the boycott idea, and I said Adobe is licensing all its art, so you should go and use Adobe. And then someone broke a story that actually Adobe was not quite saying everything truthfully and that they had some unlicensed stuff. And I had to revise the thing to be much vaguer, which was, unfortunate both for society and the book. It would have been nice to say, hey, go use Adobe because that'd be a lot simpler.
I know. Well, that raises a question that I've been wondering about. There's a movement that's nascent, I think, but there is a movement of people who are like, oh, we need to build a public AI, right? Like there's sort of, instead of having corporations control AI, we should have like a public version.
Complicated.
It's very expensive, and I wonder if it's worth it.
Well, I would say that building another larger language model is not worth it, right? The projection that I made that they would run out before the finish line appears to be true, right? So it would be one thing to make a giant language model if those scaling curves held indefinitely. But what we have seen in the last few weeks, as I told everybody, is you can't really do that. I'll give you a parallel, by the way, which is driverless cars. People have been promising them for quite some time. Like people like Elon Musk said in 2019, I believe it was, there'll be 1 million robo-taxis on the road by 2020. There are not. There are a few pilots in certain cities and so forth, not from his company, although he's about to start. And so, people, I warned in 2016. I said, you're not going to get to the driverless cars anytime soon. Well, why not? It's because we have this problem called outliers or edge cases. Well, what is that? Well, that's unusual circumstances, things that weren't in your data set. The only solution people have had in the AI industry, really for the last 15 years, is throw more data at the problem. And for a while that worked, but it's never really solved the problem. So what you have with driverless cars is you have one strategy is Waymo. They make very detailed maps, not just of like the streets, but like what time the streetcars are going. I'm guessing about what the details are. But so it costs them like $1 billion or something to ramp up a new city or more. Again, I don't know the exact numbers. So you have that strategy. It's not really general. So you can't just plop down a Waymo in Buffalo and get it to work in the winter. And then you have Elon's solution, which so far involves having a human pay attention at all times. And so it's not actually a driverless car. What he calls, quote, full self-driving means you pay your full attention or you might die self-driving, right? And so it's just marketing. It's not really the thing that. So, we're years and years into this process. There's way more data, but it has not solved the problem. And that is what's going to happen with large language models. And in fact, I used to say that's what's going to happen. It's a habit. I'm still saying. But now it has happened. It has in the last couple of months become clear in the industry. So pouring, government money into doing more of this is not, in my view, a good idea. A better idea would be to say, we have in machine learning something we call the explore-exploit trade-off. So explore is you try a bunch of new things, and exploit is you have something and you use it as best you can. We are in a full-time exploit mode. Everybody's using exactly the same tools. I call it an intellectual monoculture, right? When I started studying AI, there were lots of different people exploring lots of different ideas. Everybody since 2019, not everybody, almost everybody since 2019 has focused only on large language models, which now seem to be maybe running their course. And so we don't have enough people thinking about other ideas. My favorite example in the history of science is in the early 20th century, everybody thought genes were made up of some kind of protein, which was a very plausible hypothesis, but it was wrong. And so for decades, people pursued an incorrect hypothesis. And it was only in the 40s that somebody, Oswald Avery, figured out that it was wrong. Once Avery figured out that it was wrong, it was only 8 years before Watson and Crick, with Rosalind Franklin's sort of unwitting help, figured out the structure of DNA, and then things moved really fast. But it took like a long time to get people out of that intellectual monoculture. We need to get out of the large language model monoculture if we're going to make progress on AI as science, if we're going to make progress on AI that isn't discriminatory. And also we could make progress on the copyright problem. So like human artists see a lot of copyrighted art, but they don't replicate it. They know better. I did some work on these generative image models, and you can say stuff like, make an Italian plumber, and it makes you a picture of Mario from the Nintendo games. It's like, if you paid an artist and they came back with a picture of Mario, you would fire them. The most basic thing about art is be creative, do something novel.
Right.
And some future AI might actually be able to do that, to sort of have influences, like a musician might have, but come up with something new. Right, so Bob Dylan read Bertolt Brecht and he came up with something new, and he didn't just repeat it. Maybe he was a poor example. We could argue about that, but human artists create new things, and if they create things that are completely derivative, the law is against them, and also the culture is against them. Some form of better AI might be able to do that and sort of think about what it actually means to be an Italian plumber. Right, might have the concept of Italian, the concept of plumber. These current AIs don't actually have concepts, and so they can't do that. So there's every reason in the world to want to get out of this monoculture, and when we do, things could be a lot better.
Well, you managed to find a way to end on a positive note after all, so thank you.
Stuck the landing.
Thank you, everybody. This was
Thank
great.
you all. Thank you.
Oh, there were more questions.
There were more.
Okay. We can keep them.
Brent, is it true?